And now, much like the events of the last week of Jesus' life, the tone of the story as it unfolds turns quickly much darker. You probably know that after the exaltation that we have just experienced, the events of Palm Sunday, when the crowds shouted out, "Hosanna to the King," we also know that at that same time, the storm clouds were gathering. In the story immediately following the Palm Sunday day, we hear simple verses like this. "So the chief priests and the teachers of the law and some other important people tried to have him killed, but they could not find a way to do it because everyone was eager to listen to him." And soon after that, Jesus tells a parable where it becomes clear that he's criticizing the leadership and authority of all the leaders of the people. And it says, the chief priests and the teachers of the law of Moses knew that Jesus was talking about them when he was telling this story. They wanted to arrest him right then, but they were afraid of the people. Those two verses point to the strange tone in which we hear this story of the last days of Jesus' life. It is a tone of foreboding and yet a tone of sympathy as well. The various characters take their role in the story. Jesus and the religious leaders and the political leaders of Rome and the disciples, or as they're called in the Gospel of Luke, the apostles, and the larger band of disciples. And each character in the story plays their part, and we, as those who hear this story, are to begin to feel what they feel, begin to have Luke's attitude toward those characters. But the difficult thing is that Luke has to face the fact that the disciples, the apostles, were far from the followers that Jesus would have had them be in this series of events. And so the tone, as far as the disciples go, is not one of approval, certainly, but it is also not one of condemnation. Rather, it is one of sympathy for their plight as they seek to follow this one whom humans can scarcely follow. Certainly not by their own power, but rather only by the power of God. And so the passage picks up from chapter 22 of the Gospel of Luke. And as I have said in previous years, I am reading from a different translation than what you have in the Pew Bible, intentionally so that you will listen rather than read. And this should take 17 or 18 minutes. So remember that we are hearing this central story of the gospel on this Palm Sunday as we head into Holy Week. The festival of thin bread, also called the Passover, was near. The chief priests and the teachers of the law of Moses were looking for a way to get rid of Jesus because they were afraid of what the people might do. Then Satan entered the heart of Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12 apostles. Judas went to talk with the chief priests and the officers of the temple police about how he could help them arrest Jesus. They were very pleased and offered to pay Judas money. He agreed and started looking for a good chance to betray Jesus when the crowds were not around. The day had come for the festival of thin bread, and it was time to kill the Passover lambs. So Jesus said to Peter and John, "Go and prepare the Passover meal for us to eat." But they asked, "Where do you want us to prepare it?" Jesus told them, "As you go into the city, you will meet a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him into the house and say to the owner, 'Our teacher wants to know where he can eat the Passover meal with his disciples.' The owner will take you upstairs and show you a large room ready for you to use. Prepare the meal there." Peter and John left. They found everything just as Jesus had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When the time came for Jesus and the apostles to eat, he said to them, "I have very much wanted to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer. I tell you, I will not eat another Passover meal until it is finally eaten in God's kingdom." He took a cup of wine in his hands and gave thanks to God. Then he told the apostles, "Take this wine and share it with each other. I will not drink any more wine until God's kingdom comes." Jesus took some bread in his hands, and he gave thanks for it. He broke the bread and he handed it to his apostles. Then he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Eat this as a way of remembering me." And then he also, after the meal, took a cup of wine in his hands, and he said, "This is my blood. It is poured out for you, and with God, and with it, God makes a new agreement. The one who is going to betray me is here at the table with me. The Son of Man will die in the way that has been decided for him, but it will be terrible for the one who betrays him." Then the apostles started arguing about who would do such a thing. The apostles also got into an argument about which one of them was the greatest. So Jesus told them, "Foreign kings and their rulers order people around, and powerful rulers call themselves everyone's friend. But don't be like them. The most important one of you should be like the least important, and your leader should be a servant. Who do people think is the greatest, a person who is served or the one who serves? Well, it's the one who is served, right? But I've been with you as a servant. You have stayed with me in all my troubles, so I will give you the right to rule as kings, just as my Father has given me the right to rule as a king. You will eat and drink with me in my kingdom, and each of you will sit on a throne to judge the 12 tribes of Israel." Jesus said, "Simon, listen to me. Satan has demanded the right to test each of you, as a farmer does when he separates the wheat from the chaff. But Simon, I have prayed that your faith will be strong. And when you have come back to me, help the others." Peter said, "Lord, I'm willing to go with you even to jail or even to die if I have to." Jesus replied, "Peter, I tell you, before a rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will say 3 times that you don't even know me." Jesus asked his disciples, "When I sent you out without a money bag or a traveling bag or sandals, did you need anything?" "No," they answered. Jesus told them, "But now, if you have a money bag, take it with you. Also take a traveling bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell some of your clothes and buy one. Do this because the scriptures say he was considered a criminal. This was written about me, and it will soon come true." The disciples said, "Lord, here are 2 swords." "Enough of that," Jesus said. Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives, and as he often did, his disciples went with him. When they got there, he told them, "Pray that you won't be tested." Jesus walked a little way before he knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you will, please don't make me suffer by having me drink from this cup. But what you want, not what I want." Then an angel from heaven came to help him. Jesus was in great pain and prayed so sincerely that his sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. Jesus got up from praying and went over to his disciples. They were asleep, worn out from being so sad. He said to them, "Why are you asleep? Wake up and pray that you won't be tested." While Jesus was speaking, a crowd came up. It was led by Judas, one of the 12 apostles. Judas went over to Jesus and greeted him with a kiss. Jesus asked Judas, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' disciples saw what was about to happen, they asked, "Lord, should we attack them with a sword?" One of the disciples even struck at the high priest's servant with his sword and cut off the servant's right ear. "Enough of that," Jesus said. Then he touched the servant's ear and healed it. Jesus spoke to the chief priests, the temple police, and the leaders who had come to arrest him. He said, "Why do you come out with swords and clubs and treat me like a criminal? I was with you every single day in the temple, and you didn't arrest me. But this is your time. Darkness is in control." Jesus was arrested and led away to the house of the high priest, while Peter followed at a distance. Some people built a fire in the middle of the courtyard, and they were sitting around warming themselves there, and Peter was with them. And a servant girl saw him. And after she'd stared carefully at him, she said, "You're one of them." Peter said, "Woman, I don't even know the man." A little while later, someone else saw Peter and said, "You're one of them." "No, I am not," said Peter. About an hour later, another man insisted, "This man must have been with Jesus. After all, he's from Galilee, just like Jesus." Peter replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." Right then, while Peter was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The Lord turned to look at Peter, and Peter remembered that the Lord had said, "Before a rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will say 3 times that you don't know me." Then Peter went out and cried hard. The men who were guarding Jesus made fun of him and beat him. They put a blindfold on him and said, "Tell us who struck you." They kept insulting Jesus in many other ways. At daybreak, the people's leaders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law got together and brought Jesus before the council. They said, "Tell us, are you the Messiah?" Jesus replied, "If I said so, you wouldn't believe me. And if I asked you a question, you wouldn't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right side of God All-Powerful." Well, then they asked, "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus answered, "You say I am." They replied, "Why do we need more witnesses? He said it himself." Everyone in the council got up and led Jesus off to Pilate. They started accusing him and said, "We caught this man trying to get our people to riot and stop paying taxes to the emperor. He also claims to be the Messiah, our king." Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Those are your words," Jesus said. Pilate told the chief priests and the crowd, "I don't find him guilty of anything." But they all kept saying, "He has been teaching and causing trouble all over Judea. He started out in Galilee, and now he's come all the way here." When Pilate heard this, he said, "Is this man from Galilee?" After Pilate learned that he'd come from the region ruled by Herod, he sent him off to Herod, who was in Jerusalem at that time. For a long time, Herod had wanted to meet Jesus and was very happy because he wanted to see Jesus do a sign. He heard many things about Jesus and hoped to see him work this miracle. Herod asked him a lot of questions, but Jesus didn't answer. Then the chief priests and the teachers of the law of Moses stood up and accused Jesus of all kinds of bad things. Herod and his soldiers made fun of Jesus and insulted him. They put a fine robe on his back and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they'd been enemies. Pilate called together again the chief priests and the leaders and the people, and he said, "You brought Jesus to me and said he was a troublemaker, but I have questioned him here in front of you, and I have not found him guilty of anything that you say he's done." Herod didn't find him guilty either and sent him back to me. This man doesn't deserve to be put to death. I will just have him beaten with a whip and set free. But the whole crowd shouted, "Kill Jesus! Give us Barabbas!" Now, Barabbas was in jail because he'd started a riot in the city and murdered someone. Pilate wanted to set Jesus free, so he spoke again to the crowds, but they kept shouting, "Nail him to a cross! Nail him to a cross!" Pilate spoke to them for a third time. "But what crime has he done? I've not found him guilty of anything for which he should be put to death. I'll have him beaten with the whip and set free." The people kept shouting as loud as they could for Jesus to be put to death. Finally, Pilate gave in. He freed the man who was in jail for rioting and murder because he was the one the crowd wanted to be set free. Then Pilate handed Jesus over to them to do what they wanted with him. As Jesus was being led away, some soldiers grabbed hold of a man from Cyrene named Simon. He was coming in from the fields. They put a large cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large crowd was following Jesus, and in the crowd, a lot of women were crying and weeping for him. Jesus turned to those women and said, "Women of Jerusalem, don't cry for me. Cry for yourselves and for your children. Someday people will say, 'Women who never had children are really fortunate.' At that time, everyone will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us!' And they'll say to the hills, 'Hide us.' If this can happen when the wood is green, what do you think will happen when it's dry?" Two criminals were led out to be put to death with Jesus, one on his right, the other on his left. When the soldiers came to the place called the Skull, they nailed Jesus to a cross. They also nailed the two criminals to crosses, one on each side of Jesus. Jesus said, "Father, forgive these people. They don't know what they're doing." While the crowd stood there watching Jesus, the soldiers gambled for his clothes. The leaders insulted him, saying, "He saved others. Now he should save himself if he really is the chosen Messiah of God. The soldiers made fun of Jesus and brought him some wine. They said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." Above him was a sign that said, "The King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging there also insulted Jesus by saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal told the first one off, "Don't you fear God? Aren't you getting the same punishment as this man? We got what was coming to us, but he didn't do anything wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your power." Jesus replied, "I promise that today you will be with me in paradise." Around noon, the sky turned dark and stayed that way till the middle of the afternoon. The sun stopped shining, and the curtain in the temple was split down the middle. Jesus shouted, "Father, I put myself in your hands." And then he died. When the Roman officer saw what had happened, he praised God and said, "Jesus must have been a really good man." A crowd had gathered to see the terrible sight. Then after they'd seen it, they felt brokenhearted and went home. All of Jesus' close friends and the women who had come with him from Galilee stood at a distance and watched. There was a man named Joseph who was from Arimathea in Judea. Joseph was a good and honest man, and he was eager for God's kingdom to come. He also was a member of the council, but he did not agree with what they had decided to do to Jesus. Joseph went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. He took the body down from the cross and wrapped it in fine cloth. Then he put it in a tomb that had been cut out of solid rock and had never been used. It was Friday, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and watched how Jesus' body was placed in the tomb. Then they went to prepare some sweet-smelling spices for his burial. But on the Sabbath, they rested, as the law of Moses commands. This is the word of God for God's people. Amen.